Welcome back. Once believed to be myths or embellished, it turns out in the ancient world, labyrinths were actually a thing. They were a pretty big deal. In fact, if you've kept your eyes on archaeology news like I have, you'll know that one of the ancient labyrinths that was considered famous but lost to the sands of time was recently located and confirmed. What were labyrinths used for in the ancient world? Let's see if we can figure it out. Welcome to the Occult and the Apocalypse with Kristen, aka Fire Terra Mama, where I tell you how they took what was once widely known about God, spirituality, and you, and how they took that and locked it away. Come with me while I show you what I've learned from science, religion, cultural beliefs, and mythology to turn the occult and the apocalypse into just the hidden and the revealed. Now, according to Joseph L. Henderson, in The Man and His Symbols Part 2, he states, in all cultures, the labyrinth has the meaning of an entangling and confusing representation of the world of matriarchal consciousness. It can be traversed only by those who are ready for a special initiation into the mysterious world of the collective unconsciousness. Now, Henderson was an associate of Carl Jung, and Carl Jung was a famous psychoanalyst and was putting together Man and His Symbols. And he coordinated the contribution by Henderson. Now, Jung had developed a concept regarding a collective unconsciousness, essentially stating that some impulses and rituals were a collective memory from the ancestors, and you unconsciously received that information and could put similar practices into place. He arrived at this conclusion because when he was a child, growing up in a home with a distant father and a mentally ill mother, he whittled a small little figurine for himself, which he stored in the attic alongside a painted rock. He said occasionally he would go up to this figure and bring it written notes in his own secret language, and that these offerings to the figure made him feel better. For Jung's own admission, he had no inspiration for this. He had never seen anything like it on his own. He had no knowledge of ancient or indigenous cultures, etc. It just made him feel better, giving him the sense of peace and security. It was only later in life when he learned about indigenous and ancient people using totems and stones that he determined that this must have been inspired by something unconscious within him, something that his ancestors did, something that was buried in the collective unconsciousness of humans today, which helped him to rationalize why similar rituals developed in countries that were completely independent of each other. Now, Jung and his associates based a lot of their theories off of this concept of collective unconsciousness, and Jung spent a large part of his career dipping into the esoteric aspects of the human psyche, including Gnosticism, metaphysics, alchemy, and the paranormal. Now, interestingly enough, petroglyphs and cave paintings, which seem to include the labyrinth-like structures, seem to appear near supposed goddesses. And in India's Gantra labyrinth, it was thought to ease childbirth. The Hopi considered the labyrinth as a representation of the Great Mother, and in the Roman world, they were thought to ward off evil, as evil spirits would not be able to find their way. Now, the difference between a labyrinth and a maze is very clear, although these days they seem to be used relatively synonymously. Mazes have false starts, dead ends, twists and turns. A labyrinth, although having turns, has a single path to walk, which leads to a central space and then back out. Now, the Labyrinth of Egypt, which was recently confirmed, was written about by Herodotus, the Greek author and historian who lived somewhere between 484 and 425 BC. In Book 2 of Herodotus' Histories, he says of the Egyptians, made a labyrinth which surpasses even the pyramids. It has 12 roofed courts with doors facing each other. 6 face north and 6 south, in 2 continuous lines, all within one outer wall. There are also double sets of chambers, 3,000 altogether, 1,500 above and the same number underground. We learned through conversation about the underground chambers. The Egyptian caretakers would by no means show them, as they were, as they said, the burial vaults of the kings who first built the labyrinth and of the sacred crocodiles. The upper we saw for ourselves, and they are creations greater than human. The exits of the chamber and the mazy passages hither and thither through the courts were an unending marvel tour. He goes on to say, over all this is a roof made of stone like the walls, and the walls are covered with cut figures, and every stone is very precisely fitted together. Near the corner where the labyrinth ends stands a pyramid 240 feet high, on which great figures are cut. A passage to this has been made underground. Now, this observation would have been about 400 years after Amenhotep III would have built the pyramid, or been buried within the pyramid. And his daughter, Sober-Neferkuru, the first female pharaoh, also made additions to the complex as a whole. This dynastic ruler would have been the one right after the pharaoh that I've previously associated with Abraham's time. The labyrinth was attested to for an additional 600 years by different geographers and historians who made statements such as, there is still in Egypt a labyrinth which was first constructed 3,600 years ago, they say. Many assert that it's a building consecrated to the sun, an opinion that mostly prevails. A thing that surprises me is that the building is constructed of Parian marble, while other parts of the columns are Syenites, which with such solidarity is this huge man constructed that the lapses of ages has been totally unable to destroy it, which was written around 44 AD. And then finally, somewhere around 200 AD, where it's documented that Septimius Severus, Roman emperor, visited the structure. It's said that the Greco-Roman buildings were built on a portion of it, and after Roman rule, it was quarried for its stone. It was then lost to time until the 21st century, when a site recovery expedition project began to try to save the crumbling, now 4,000-year-old pyramid at the complex. At that time, military-grade satellite ground penetration had revealed a huge structure near the pyramid, which is in fact appears to be a multi-leveled and have small rooms and corridors. This was a huge funerary temple complex, the Labyrinth of Amenhotep III, who was worshipped for nearly 2,000 years. And the labyrinth symbol has been used since ancient cave carvings. It appears to have been born out of the spiral, which may have been used to encourage spiritual reflection. It seems that in the ancient world, the labyrinth was intended as a representation of a spiritual journey, although that's not necessarily the case when we're talking about the Minoan labyrinth of Crete, possibly at the island of Knossos. Now, according to the legend, King Minos asked the gods for some divine protection, and he was miraculously given a white bull to sacrifice back to Poseidon. However, this bull, being a beautiful, pure white, King Minos decides to keep for himself. And this angered the gods so much that they cursed King Minos' wife to fall in love with and mate with the bull. She then gave birth to Astaris, known as the Minotaur. It was said that after causing the death of King Minos' human son, and due to the Minotaur's bloodthirst, Athens was to send 7 boys and 7 girls every 9 years to feed the Minotaur, who was kept in the labyrinth. It was on the 3rd feeding that the son of the king of Athens went, captured the heart of the Minoan princess, who gave him some assistance, some yarn to help him mark his way along the labyrinth and find his way back out. He successfully killed the Minotaur and came back out. Now, there is a palace at Knossos, and the palace itself has many turns and bends resembling a labyrinth, and this may have been the source of the myth. However, the labyrinth that's said to have housed the Minotaur has never been discovered. It is said, however, that the ancient world may have witnessed the labyrinth directly, and that the labyrinth of Crete was merely a copy of the Egyptian labyrinth. The palace at Knossos was abandoned after a huge fire around 1380 BC. However, wall art that still exists depicts a labyrinth with a bull on it, lending additional credence to the fact that the labyrinth may have been an actual thing. There's also a lot of evidence of a close connection between the Minoan culture and the Hisco portion of Egypt, the Hisco-controlled Egypt, making the two cultures likely to have crossed at some point in time. This labyrinth, if real, was not built for reverence and inner spiritual growth, but instead for fear and confusion. Now, there have been petroglyphs of labyrinth shapes that could date back as far as Neolithic times. However, petroglyphs can be very difficult to date, and some have been assumed to be Roman graffiti. However, over in Ireland, there are spirals carved into the entrance stone at Newgrange. These carvings were made about 5,000 years ago, and although they're often identified as Celtic symbols, they actually predate Celtic presence in Ireland. Although not quite a labyrinth itself, they're reminiscent of a single path reaching a center while winding around. Could these be a precursor to labyrinths? Well, looking at the Americas, we know that labyrinths have been used for thousands of years, and they've been used by multiple indigenous cultures. The Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community adopted man in the maze as their seal. It's believed to represent an elder or medicine man living in a place where the people could not find him. For the Hopi, there's the symbol of Tapu At, or mother and child. There are 2 labyrinths, one circle, the other square, which represent the womb of Mother Earth. The circular labyrinth represents the road of a human life. Spiritual rebirth is attained in following it. It seems as though labyrinths with their single pathway to center were a spiritual journey, whereas mazes, on the contrary, were developed for confusion or trapping dead or evil spirits. Another area of note when looking at labyrinths is to look at the Nazca lines. These carefully crafted, gigantic images seen only from the sky have perplexed archaeologists and anthropologists for years. There's images of monkeys and spiders and even the picture of a man. The running theory is that the indigenous people at Nazca used these giant earthen lines to walk in meditation, and perhaps each shape stood for a different want or aspect of human need, a spiritual journey, or a god or a goddess. These are actually similar in concept to something found on the other side of the world in Roman estates. Roman labyrinths, which would be tiled as mosaics into the floor of Roman homes or public spaces available to the affluent. In Rome, labyrinths were all the rage. The labyrinth could be walked as a form of meditation or prayer. And it's important to acknowledge that indigenous people on this side of the planet also used and revered labyrinths in pre-Columbian history, long before the colonization and Christianization of the people. And the reason that that's important to acknowledge is because after the Christianization of Rome, labyrinths and their sacred paths for prayer became a Christian symbol, because when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Now, the Romans really appear to have been some of the newest kids on the block when it came to labyrinths. In fact, there was a labyrinth on the Greek island of Lemnos in addition to the one in Crete, and there was also a known labyrinth associated with the Etruscans, who were the culture in Italy before Romans took power. For the labyrinth at Lemnos, it's not yet been found, if it ever will be. It was written about by Pliny the Elder in his multi-volume series, Natural History. Natural History was meant to be a reference book set and is considered the first set of encyclopedias. And it is still referenced today, and most of the sites in it have been confirmed by archaeology. Now, according to Pliny, the labyrinth was supported by 150 columns, and gates were so well balanced that a child could open them. At the time that he wrote this, somewhere around 77 AD, he reports that there were still traces of it in his time. This makes it more likely that it was much more ancient than he, although it's unclear how ancient it could be. The island was visited in 1801 in an attempt to locate the ruins, however, they weren't found. Now, similarly, the Etruscan labyrinth has also not been found, but it, like the Egyptian labyrinth, was supposed to be a tomb. Interestingly enough, it was the Etruscan general Lars Porsena. Now, Pliny himself did not see the labyrinth. However, he quotes an earlier source extensively regarding it. Pliny's quote starts, "Above this square building there stands 5 pyramids, one at each corner and one at the center, 75 feet broad at the base and 150 feet high. These pyramids so taper in shape that atop all of them together there is supported a brazen globe, and upon that again a pedestal from which bells are suspended by chains. These make a tinkling sound when blown apart by the wind." All of that and a labyrinth that you could get lost in underneath? Well, I'm not sure. The general was somewhere around 508 BC, and the entire city was torn down, razed to the ground, with the rest of the city at about 89 BC by Rome, because the Romans are really known for doing what the Etruscans did. So here's what fascinates me. It almost sounds like this Etruscan general was inspired by another pyramid labyrinth complex that we've talked about, the one in Egypt. Could this have been an homage to a labyrinth that he had witnessed in his own past? Possibly, and the Etruscans are not even where we end. In ancient Persian literature, the earliest mention of labyrinths is in the Avesta, some of which has been dated back to 1500 BC. In these texts, the labyrinth is a symbol of the human journey to enlightenment. In later Persian literature, labyrinths are routinely featured among all types of literature. Poetry, hymns, epics, you name it, it likely had a labyrinth in it. There are also labyrinths in India, Nepal, and southern Africa. Labyrinths have literally been a repeating theme throughout human history, and I imagine myself within one. The walls smooth and hand-worn, the path appearing to be straight or curving slightly, never-ending, giving the traveler time to consider just each step and what that step means, knowing that at some point it will open up to a center feature, whether a hall or an oval room, vast and empty. Perhaps there are alcoves in this center space, recessed spaces where spiritual treasures or something ancient or thought-provoking is set. As a traveler, you'd reach this space, spend whatever time was needed or appropriate at the center, and then going out the same way, from the internal to the external. In fact, labyrinths are so innately perceived as an opportunity for contemplation that they are still built today. You can find them in parks and meditation spaces as walking paths. And recently, two very large hedge labyrinths were created. One, identified as the largest ever, is in China called the Dream Maze, and the other is named Mason Labyrinth, which was inaugurated in 2015. Mason Labyrinth is 80,000 square meters and also houses many of the personal art and cultural collection of Franco Maria Ricci, which ends at a pyramid which houses a chapel. Located in Italy, this is considered a work of art and is definitely on my bucket list. It's considered the greatest bamboo labyrinth. And with the pyramid and chapel, that really catches my attention. Inevitably, it pulls us together from the present back to the past. You have to wonder, while millions of humans have walked through so many labyrinths over so many thousand years, usually performing a ritual or signifying a spiritual journey, what did these people feel entering these subterranean areas on a quest to find something new about perhaps themselves on the journey inward, experiencing a rebirth upon exiting? I'll leave that for you to think about in the meantime. Join me next week when we talk about Adam. And until then, thank you for helping me take the occult and the apocalypse into just the hidden and the revealed. I will see you next week.